Hello, my friends, and welcome to FISHTORY. I'm Alexander Williamson, and I will be your host today. My cat is running around like a little cat.
Really? What are you? Hey, you, get up.
I have a gremlin who wants to disrupt the video. She's been chewing on me, been chewing on the stand of the camera. Take three. Get up. And I refuse to lock her up. I've already played with her for 2 hours. So she may be knocking over the camera or appearing in the background or jumping on me. We're just going to roll with it because this is take 6 and I'm just really worn out. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about long format content versus short format content and why I tend not to create short format content as much as the deep dives, and why I think there's such a difference. And you can get great information on platforms like TikTok, on platforms like Reels or Instagram or Facebook Shorts or whatever, wherever you want to get it. There are videos of 30 seconds of knowledge that are great. I think nobody can argue that if you do it right, you can do a lot in that time. Now, my main issue is, one, not everyone learns the same way. So in my videos, I like to tell you what I'm going to tell you, explain it in 1 or 2 different ways, show you a visual or an example, and then another way of explaining it, or another instance in which the situation is going on or could occur, or if it occurs in this context, do this or do that, you know. So trying to teach so that you can then later use your own power of inference and observation and deduction to make choices with bigger questions and bigger situational information than just the context of that one fact that was told to you in 30 seconds or whatnot. So, I mean, in 30 seconds, you can explain to someone, that gravity is a force and, it's constant what gravity is. Yet there are entire majors that focus on the physics of gravity. I mean, things like it acting equally on a feather or on a lead weight, as long as air resistance isn't a factor. So that may be a really cool fact, but the thing you aren't saying is that, well, we have air in all practical situations. Air resistance is going to make the feather fall much slower and not have anywhere near the force. Even if you had the weight of feathers, 1 pound of feathers versus a 1 pound lead weight, that's gonna smack someone in the head and hurt a lot more. But you get the idea of the context there, where you might be able to get a tidbit on what gravity is, see Newton and an apple dropping and hitting his head, and understanding some basic concepts, maybe even like a time-space grid, and a cat that just won't stop knocking the camera over. And you might realize, okay, this is like what gravity is by definition. But will you be able to understand or apply any of that? Probably not. And, will you be able to mathematically predict anything with that? No, definitely not. Maybe you could predict, enough of that something hard falling on you, something dense is going to hurt. But not even that, probably, because I just described the air resistance thing. And do you know about the air resistance in your reality versus a theoretical physics reality and what the equations say? That same concept with shorts is you don't get the full picture. And the other thing that you don't get is you don't get the exceptions that are common. You don't get the practical applications a lot of times. And if somebody is including these, they can be included in shorts, but you basically have to do like 5 shorts to communicate the full story or the same amount of information, which is fine. But at the end of the day, you're going to be talking the same amount of time. You're going to be sharing the same information in different ways over the course of several shorts. And if that's more digestible for people, that's very understandable. But it's also, for me, just understandable to see that feeling disjointed. And like, I want to sit down and see all 5 episodes in a row. I don't want to have to get served one by the algorithm and then go off topic to a funny video for, the next 2 or 3, and then educational, and then, there's the 3rd in the series and not the 2nd, and I'm missing the 2nd one. So to me, I think it's important that I can keep control of that. And speaking of control, I think a lot of times with shorts, people get robbed who would otherwise be great presenters and completely factual. But for instance, they have an editor who doesn't know the content like they know the content. And so they make assumptions, and they take a clip with the person saying something like, these fish breathe air, and fish breathe oxygen. And people might assume that fish come to the surface and breathe air from the atmosphere. Or are we talking about labyrinth fish that have the ability to actually gulp air and absorb it in an organ in their, you know, in their head? Or are we talking about like catfish that can gulp air and then their digestive tract, literally their intestines, and can, yes, literally their colon can absorb the oxygen into their blood? What are we talking about? And how does it happen? And practically, I mean, do you need to oxygenate the water in your tank? Like, what good does this information do you? So you can edit someone out of context, or you can edit somebody where they're talking about a specific situation that doesn't sound like it makes any sense in other situations. Corridoras can breathe through their butt. And the thing is, clips that sound interesting or that sound like an exceptional fact, if you say that, did you know there's a fish that can breathe out of water? There's a lot of fish that can breathe out of water. But maybe that's the title of the short, is these incredible fish can breathe out of water. That would sound like an exceptional fact, whereas a lot of fish can breathe out of water. Can they survive out of water? No. Can they breathe long-term out of water? Maybe not that either. But there are some that can, but they need to be in water because they're fish, and they need it on their gills and their biofilm and all this other stuff. But you're going to miss all that context. And a lot of times when either AI or a human is an editor and cutting that, you just won't have that nuance, and it won't be explained to you ever, and you won't get the full picture. And you may make inferences like, oh, that seems to be rare, and they're telling me about this fact about this one fish that can come up and breathe out of water. That must mean that it's rare in all other fish, or all other fish do the opposite. That might be a logical conclusion to jump to, but that's something that's not necessarily true. But it's very easy to color your entire world with assumptions like that when you have these little bits of information that aren't in context, that don't have a use case or don't have a specific example. That's why it's so helpful to present a concept as one whole unit. And I want to show you a couple examples here before we go of perfect, like, great videos that I think are good shorts. They've got good content, but I want to point out, we're going to listen to some TikToks here really quick. And I want to point out that I've done videos on these same topics very recently, and they've actually been very nuanced. And there's actually a lot more detail than what these truthful shorts have to say. And even though they're not necessarily maybe telling you something wrong, or if they are, it's by default, by assumption of what wasn't told to you, you could still make a very, very fatal flaw using the limited information versus when you get the whole concept. And so I want to illustrate that for you guys here with a couple examples. So I want to go over fish vision really quick here and see videos on this. This looks like a popular one. It's got 50,000 hearts or likes. And let's see here what this guy covers.
They have the red and they have the green. They are missing the blue cone cells. Now, when we humans have this,
so that's what I thought would happen.
Completely missing the blue vision, it is called tritanopia, or the absence of blue.
A lot of people don't get the nuance of it when you really look into the science. Fish may only have a certain amount of cones, and then they Google what that means, like human vision, if you have this many rods or cones, but that's not the same in animals. It doesn't mean that they can't see blue if they don't have the blue receptor in their eye. You know, fish actually have receptors in their brain, and they can actually infer or, you know, guess what's there and fill it in, basically hallucinating into their vision different colors based on these other receptor cells. When they're talking about this, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't see blue. That's the interesting part. it may mean that they have a rod cell in their nerve bundle, or it may mean that they have a receptor that's different, but it doesn't necessarily mean they don't see that. And that's only a recent development that we understand this, but that's just pointing out the difference between the biology of humans and fish. And it would be a very easy thing to assume that they just have no blue vision because of that. And so then he's going on the rest of this episode showing how they have no blue vision. Well, it turns out that, you know, a lot of fish may not have the blue cones, but they can still be trained to go for a blue item in different shades of blue and things like that. So they're still able to pick it out of a lineup, which a colorblind person, for instance, is not able to do. So it's not the full picture, which is something that I feel like the deep dive content, you can really get into the nuances of, whereas this is kind of just explaining it, like, generally speaking. I want to look at another video. This one's got 100,000 likes, and it goes over apparently tests that were done on the fish. So I'm much more curious to hear about this, because the last video was like, they don't see blue, right? And this, they don't see blue, is what he said in the last video. They don't have the blue cone cells. Well, let's hear what this says when it's actually tested. So is it that they don't see blue items, or is it that there's actually certain hues they don't see quite as well? Or you know, like, what are they trained to do? I'm curious to hear, like, the difference in that subtlety.
Few interesting things. The first thing you need to know is that largemouth bass have dichromatic vision, which means they use two different color receptors to see light. Now, specifically for largemouth bass, on one end of the spectrum is green, and on the other end of the spectrum is red.
And remember, we actually can see brown and yellow on a TV when we see green and red next to each other. They look like different shades of that from far away. So there's all sorts of crazy optical tricks that can happen. I go into this in my long form content, but let's hear about the rest of the test. He's on a really good track for being such a short video so far. I mean, he hasn't said any wrong information, which is great.
They see green and red really, really well, or they can differentiate those two colors extremely well. But then in between, there's sort of some problem colors. So what are the problem colors? Specifically, they have a hard time differentiating chartreuse from white. Chartreuse and white look roughly the same to largemouth bass. Bass that were trained to strike the chartreuse lures only struck chartreuse less than half of the time, compared to an 85% success rate for red and a 72% success rate for green.
All right, so as we just saw, it's easy to assume that because fish don't have the blue vision, they don't have the blue cones, which is what humans have, cones for color vision. Then we have another thing that's not even talked about in this video called rods that tells us kind of the lines and the contrast, the light and the dark scale. That kind of gives us our grayscale or our lines to fill in the picture, whereas the color is colored by those cells. Well, in fish, they have completely different evolutionary systems. Sometimes they sense things from cells that we don't even have access to in our brain setup anymore. For instance, in the video I just went into, they're talking about how fish use cues from their pineal gland in their brain through their skull and through their flesh, and they can tell light or day, light or dark, night or day. They can tell if something's like coming over them like a predator, and that's directly linked to their glands that produce adrenaline, and that will literally get them going way quicker than a human that has information on that visually, but has to then think and process, okay, what am I going to do with this? So that's why fish are able to dart off so quickly, and that context is lost. Or the fact here, we're going to watch one more little clip, and these are both popular clips, but in this first one, the guy didn't talk about the blue cone cells. So you may assume that they can't see anything that's blue, or maybe anything that's purple, because that's red and blue, right? You might understand that color theory. You might understand a little bit of human biology. But with that clip, you see that he says the facts that chartreuse is a color green, light green, is the color that you can't discern as when the bass can't discern. And yellowy green, light green, and white are hard to discern. Is that what you would have taken away from them not having blue cones? I would have assumed that they can't see blue shades very well. And maybe, maybe you assume that it works like color blindness in humans, and it doesn't at all. And so in my long 20-minute episode, it may seem like extra info or background knowledge that you don't need, but the difference in knowing that would totally color how you then hear short facts of information later. So if you hear they don't have certain cone cells, you may still know from my video, yeah, but they have other ways of telling color, and they have other ways of telling contrast, and maybe those color things don't matter because they can see, for instance, UV light, and in their world, that's more important than the information from RGB color like on a TV. And so I think, like, while that second clip is all true, it's a lot better in that it doesn't feed you incorrect information, whereas the first clip may be true as well, but you're going to make some major assumptions, assuming that human biology, fish biology is the same, assuming that color theory is a certain way, and, I think that right there tells you a whole lot. It's just like in this last little clip we're going to look at, where I want to point out to you what goes on very subtly, and this is something that confused me early on in the hobby.
Start off here talking about GH, KH, pH, so on and so forth, and it looks like we got Wicked Betas talking about betas. So let's hear what they have to say. This was something that I went into for about 20 minutes to try to explain it really thoroughly. They're going to cover it in like a minute, so let's see the difference.
pH and GH on water tests. Well, pH means potential hydrogen, which is the amount of hydrogen within the water. The smaller the number, the more acidic the water, meaning more hydrogen ions are there. Higher numbers mean it's more basic or alkaline, so there's going to be less hydrogen ions. Betas and many other fish live in waters with a pH ranging from 6.5 to 8, which means neutral towards more basic. Tannins can be...
Okay, so I first of all want to just nitpick just a teeny bit here, saying that betas are usually in 6.5 all the way to 8. No. Betas naturally live in black water oftentimes, or at least in flooded jungles, flooded fields, and rice paddies and so forth, which have a lot of botanicals as well as just grass and other plants, jungle plants as well, that have fallen or have died, become waterlogged, and are in there, and they turn into tannic acid or black water. So it's usually on the acidic side, even though the ground and some of the bedrock in a lot of Southeast Asia may have minerality to it, the water is still going to be acidic. Now, in the hobby, they're going to be somewhere around 6.0 to maybe 7.5 as their comfortable range. But I just wanted to make note of that while we're watching this video. So let's continue.
Enter the water to help lower pH, but as long as the pH remains stable and doesn't fluctuate too wildly, your betta should be fine, as it's the fluctuation that harms them, and they are very adaptable. But how do you stop pH from fluctuating and harming your fish? Well, this is where the KH and the GH come in. So, what are they? KH stands for carbonate hardness, and it refers to how well the water buffers pH. Another way of saying it stops the pH from fluctuating wildly. The higher the KH, the harder it is for the pH to change, and you'll generally want this number between 4 and...
So did you catch that at the end there? DKH. That is degrees of carbonate hardness. That is a fine video on most of the information, and it's fine even if you're already informed. It's a great video, but why would you need to watch it if you're already informed? But degrees of carbonate hardness is very different than KH just on its own, which is parts per million. Degrees of carbonate hardness, the DKH says 4 or 5 on his video, which is 17.9 parts per million. So 18 parts per million. There's an 18-fold difference in how you could interpret that info. And so if you go online and you look up, oh, what's the KH for Caridina shrimp, and you see that it's 4, you may assume that's 4 parts per million and that you should adjust accordingly, and that's just barely a trace of KH, right? But when you realize that it's actually degrees, that it's 4 degrees of carbonate hardness, then you realize for your betta or your shrimp or whatever, you realize, oh, okay, so that's more like 78 or 82, something like that, parts per million. So it's still, in the scheme of things, not a ton, but it is a lot less specific than talking about 4 parts per million. So not getting that context, is it a huge deal? No, not usually, but every once in a while, and you just make an assumption based on what has come through your feed, and you just assume that your feed, like, okay, this is the info I needed, and you're looking quick, and you would never know the difference. Whereas if you look up a longer form content of the subject matter, you know, oh, okay, so there's DKH and there's KH, and then also none of that actually matters. You know, if all they really needed was minerality, it's actually a GH problem. So then there's the whole aspect of you don't know what you're missing from a conversation unless you're being taught by somebody who understands the concept very well. And I think a lot of times people just Google things, make a video, and relay what they learned on Google, but that context is what you're paying for. That's the important part at the end of the day. And so I hope that I can provide that for you guys here on my channel, on FISHTORY, and that the creators you watch, that they do provide that, and that the short form content that you watch, that it provides great, you know, either entertainment value or, you know, information, but that that you take it in a limited scope and in a case-by-case basis, and don't infer a whole lot from a very limited data set or information set. As always, you guys, I love you. I appreciate you. I couldn't do this stuff without you. And it's you guys who still tune in, even though the algorithm doesn't always like to serve up long-form content, that make the world go around here at FISHTORY, that make the channel possible, that let me do this full time, that let me get so acquainted with the information that I can tell you about the exceptions and the context and all of that. And so thank you. And I hope you have a great day. Take care, and I'll see you next time on FISHTORY.